Dear friends in Jesus Christ, the Gospel of today is taken from St. Luke chapter 18 and verses from 9 to 14. This is the parable of the Pharisee and tax collector. It is yet another parable on prayer, and it is unique to the Gospel of Luke. Last week, Jesus taught us on the need and importance of perseverance in prayer. This week, he teaches on the importance and quality of prayer. Before we reflect on the prayer made by the Pharisee, let us understand the Pharisees. In Aramaic, the word Pharisee means a group separate or a group set apart. They tried to live the sacred law completely. Pharisees were considered as an example for being honest, respectful, and being right in the eyes of God. People also gave Pharisees few nicknames. They were called as blood-headed Pharisees because to avoid looking at women in the streets, they bumped into the walls. They were also called as bookkeeper Pharisees because they kept a very rigid and exact record of their good deeds to be praiseworthy. They were also called as wait a minute Pharisees because they told people to wait a minute and went to perform a good deed even in the middle of a conversation or other activities. All these show that they want to be good. They prayed 3 times a day without fail. It was considered that praying at the temple is more effective. So often they went to temple to pray. And usually when they prayed, they articulated their prayers. Thus one could hear clearly when or what is being prayed. The Pharisee in this parable of today exceeded the standards set by the Mosaic law. The law of Moses says that Jews must fast 1 day in a year, but this Pharisee fasted twice a week. The Mosaic law says that Jews must pay 1/10 of all they produced in the fields and from the flocks. But the Pharisee in the parable prays that he paid tithes of all he possessed. Though he has to pay tithe of his income, but he paid tithe of his income as well as of his possession. Yes, he was more than good in keeping up the law. There is no doubt about it, but the problem was his attitude. He had an attitude of condemning the other. His prayer was not a prayer or conversation with God. Rather, his prayer was a kind of reminder of his good deeds to God. It was not a thanksgiving. It was a record of his actions. The prayer was full of himself. The pronoun I has been repeated many times in his prayer. He considered himself better than others. He is tempted to compare himself with others. Contrast to this attitude of the Pharisee, we have the prayer of the tax collector. Tax collectors of that time were like social outcasts. Tax collectors were working for the Romans. Romans had conquered the Jews and promoted their pagan gods and worship. So Jews hated Romans socially and religiously. They also hated people who worked for them. Jews called tax collectors as robbers of Rome. Taxes were high, and tax collectors also extracted something for themselves and profited. In this regard, tax collectors were considered as traitors and collaborators of Romans, and commonly considered that tax collectors had a very little hope of salvation. Thus, tax collectors had a very poor social and religious standing as compared to Pharisees. But when he came to pray, he surrendered himself to the mercy of God. He did not dare to raise his eyes or his voice. It expresses his guilt that he was feeling, which comes from one's awareness of his or her sinfulness and human vulnerability. He was beating his breast. This is a gesture one does at the time of great distress. We read in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23 and verse 48, people who witnessed the death of Jesus returned home as they were beating their breasts. This gesture is more than asking for mercy. It is a gesture of deep pain and guilt. Yes, it is an acknowledgement of his inadequacy. When Jesus was saying this parable, given the situation and understanding, people who were listening to Jesus would have thought that Jesus would give them the Pharisee as an example to follow. But Jesus, through this parable, told them the important lesson that we can learn from the tax collector for our prayer. God's mercy and blessings cannot be received by one's merit. It is a gift. As we must become worthy to receive it. The essential quality to receive it is to acknowledge the human fragility and vulnerability. In the first reading of today, Sirach says that our prayer life will be inevitably be connected with the rest of our lives. We cannot live one way and prayer in another way. Our prayer reflects our life, and our life reflects our prayer. A good life comes from emptying ourselves and letting God to come in. The prayer of the tax collector is marked by three qualities. They are humility, simplicity, and honesty. The humility is manifested by the fact that he did not raise his eyes to heaven. The simplicity is manifested through his prayer of petition and entrusting himself to the compassion of the Lord. The honesty of his prayer is manifested as he acknowledges himself as a sinner and in need of the mercy of God. Dear friends in Jesus Christ, let us take conscious efforts to practice humility, simplicity, and honesty in our life and in our prayer. May God bless you all. Amen.